Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise. My guest today is Ross Douthat, columnist at the New York Times, author of many books. We started off by talking about a recent column of Ross's about polyamory and the extent to which it is a repackaging of the norms that came out of the sexual revolution. We also spoke about why there has been no push so far for legalized polygamous marriage, the nature of re-paganisation, euthanasia as an example of re-paganisation and problems with the re-paganisation thesis. In the extended part of the episode, we also spoke about the failures of new atheism and the nature of Christian conversion. That extended version of the episode is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com, where, as always, you can also find the back catalogue of extended episodes, the MMM chat community, and also the bonus episodes I do with my husband. Enjoy. Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show. Ross, I enjoyed this piece that you wrote in your New York Times column in a couple of months ago now about polyamory, and particularly about Huberman's recent travails in relation to polyamory or failed polyamory. I don't know. this New York Magazine cover about the fact that he has the famous neuroscientist podcaster has all these girlfriends and he's been deceiving them about the existence of the other girlfriends and so on. And the point you make, which I thought was funny and true, was that in a sense what polyamory is trying to do is trying to accept the sexual revolution, accept promiscuity and male sexual appetites and so on, but put them into a more orderly and sort of safe and therapy speak container to make them tolerable, mostly for women, I think. It's a way of women processing the existence of the sexual revolution without actually resisting it, I think, have I got that right? That was your argument.
That might be a more intelligent restatement or more interesting restatement of my argument. But yes, it was something like that. The jumping off point, as I recall, was that, New York Magazine had this run of cover stories, one a sort of user's guide to polyamory, right? And then one this, not sort of intensely moralistic, but at least somewhat moralistic treatment of the buff bearded scientist podcaster's multiple affairs, right? I shouldn't say affairs since he's not married. His multiple relationships, and there were people on social media who just said things like, there's this tension here. 1 minute New York Magazine is telling us polyamory is good, and the next minute it's polyamory shaming poor Dr. Huberman. I'm not a regular listener to his podcast, as anyone who examines my physique would know. But yeah, and I thought other people said this, but I thought that was wrong. I think you have to see polyamory as an attempt to do something different than just sort of say, powerful men are going to have a lot of girlfriends, and if they're married, they're going to have mistresses, and that's fine. That's not at all what polyamory is doing. It is trying to sort of negotiate a space where you can have sort of, I mean, I think a version of what you just said, but sort of therapeutically managed promiscuity where no one's feelings get hurt, and there's no deception, right? I mean, the good doctor was engaged in a sort of serial deception of essentially making promises of at least quasi fidelity to these women. At least with at least one of them, he was trying to conceive a child, I think, right? And none of them knew about the other. And the polyamory is basically saying, well, we can solve all of the unhappiness associated with this kind of behavior, not by, expecting people to be monogamous and be in bourgeois marriages and all of the stuff that, we think is out of date. We can solve it by making sure everyone communicates adequately about their sexual needs and their emotional needs, and that with the right balance of communication, people can be married or in relationships, also have sex with other people, and this will all be liberated and fine, right? And female friendly in some sense, right? That this is sort of, in a way, an attempted resolution to some of the issues that that you raised in your own book about the sexual revolution, right? The odd way in which we had a sort of feminist social revolution that ended up sort of defending a sexual landscape that seemed to be oriented more around male sexual desire, right? How do you resolve that tension? Well, if you don't want to be bourgeois or heteronormative or monogamous or Christian, right? You can say, well, we're going to feminize promiscuity, maybe.
Yes, except of course, as you know, um, Huberman's apparently extremely good at using therapy speak to manage the women in his life. He speaks fluent Californian, right? And that doesn't seem to have been. I mean, what you sort of suspect from it. I don't want to speculate too much on. Have you noticed, by the way, that he is just steamrolling through this? He's just not publicly acknowledged it at all. If anything, his podcast has become more successful. There's been this kind of Streisand effect where it's only done him good. But anyway,
I mean, no, and I think that's, I mean, this is a separate kind of discussion, but I think that is just sort of characteristic of the current dispensation, that people have recognized that once you are subjected to an attempted cancellation, right, or whatever we want to call it, right, there is the audience landscape now is sort of segmented enough, and there's enough room to operate without the approval of New York Magazine, that you actually gain nothing by sort of trying to reconcile yourself with or apologize in any way. So yeah, I think that's, I mean, you see that with lots of people now. He's not the only case study, but I think it is a sort of a real sort of shift in the landscape from 4 or 5 years ago. Like, he didn't put out a statement saying, I'm growing and learning and seeking my truth, and I apologize to anyone who I have inadvertently hurt. I mean, which he probably would have done had this happened in 2019 even.
Yes. And I guess he sort of relied on an assumption, which I saw expressed quite a lot on social media in response to this, an assumption expressed more often by men, which was that, but of course, this is one of the perks of being Huberman. Like, you're handsome, you're successful, who the hell wouldn't think that this man, he's in his 40s or whatever as well, and he doesn't have children. I mean, like, what did he think he was doing? Sort of the assumption that this is what high status men tend to do. The thing that was dubious about it, and the thing that was the target of particular opprobrium in the piece, was that he was being deceptive. And you had to sort of assume that deception must have been part of the thrill for him, because if he'd wanted to do normal spreadsheet polyamory, he could have done so. There would have been no shortage of candidates.
Well, do we think so? I mean, this is one of the open questions, right, in the polyamory craze, is to what extent is that true, right? It's tough to get large number or sort of realistic numbers about how many people are actually engaged in polyamory. I will say that, in my own sort of social worlds to the extent that they touch on those worlds. I have not encountered a lot of what I would call sort of high status women engaging in polyamory. I mean, again, this is I'm speaking from limited experience, right? But it seems to me that like you have different categories. You have women, the woman, I'm going to forget her name, who wrote the memoir right recently about being, entering into an open marriage and having all of these sexual
Which one? I
right,
swear there's one of
the
those
one
memoirs.
that I think Mary Harrington reviewed it. It was
Okay,
reviewed.
yes.
It was reviewed everywhere.
I think I have it on my shelves.
Yes, it's an
I was sent a
important
copy, yeah.
text for our time. But that seemed like a classic case of a woman in a marriage doesn't want, the husband wants to open the marriage. She doesn't want to lose her husband, so she sort of enters into this lifestyle, right? So you have cases like that, and then you have sort of the kind of Bay Area polycule world, right? And then you have a lot of people where it's sort of like you're calling something poly, right? But it's really just somebody kind of juggling multiple relationships in a way that, you would see in dating markets in the 1970s or 1980s. I'm just not sure. My guess is that there is a subset of desirable women who would like to date someone like, a handsome 40 something well off celebrity podcaster who are much more likely to date him just to stick with him if they think there's a possibility that they're his one and only, and who would certainly not want to say, "Oh, I'm part of a famous podcaster's harem," right? Not that there aren't some who would want that, but I feel like you expand your pool through the deception of the false promise of monogamy, even now.
Yes, I'm sure that's true. Evolutionary psychologist Diana Fleischman, who's a friend and has been on this podcast, and is poly herself. She says that women have a threshold. There's a threshold at which the man is so attractive that you will accept being part of the harem.
Right.
And every woman has that threshold, and every man is somewhere on that scale, and that I guess, yes. So Huberman has very high sexual market value. So presumably he could have still had
Right. He could have.
a
Right.
harem,
Yes. He could.
an open harem if he'd wanted, but maybe not. Maybe yes, you're right. Maybe he's slightly persuaded some women. Those are kind of marginal cases.
Is there also a limit though on the harem size, right? Too, like I feel like I could imagine, again, a sort of desirable, high status woman saying, "Well, I'm dating this celebrity podcaster, and he's dating a couple of other, he's seeing another woman at the same time. He's seeing two other women at the same time." I also feel like that's different from saying, I'm one of seven women. I'm his girl. I'm his girl in Minneapolis, and it just, I don't know. Again, it just seems like sort of, it's like a difference between saying like, well, it's also like the difference between saying, well, I have a husband and I tolerate his occasional affair, versus I don't even have enough status to rank as one of the the top, the inner circle or something. Again, this is, I'm speculating in ignorance here. So
Yes, I mean, I think the thing that we're alighting on is that it's an unstable system because there are so many options within it, and in some senses, the most stable form of polyamory is probably the most traditional form of polyamory, which is, well, either the harem in the sort of Islamic way, where all the women have an established legal position and are relatively equal to one another, or the sort of Tony Soprano model, where you have your wife and your children, and then you have women on the side who are, those are the two models which seem to be stable in a sense, as long as the women will accept them. But those are not, those can be dressed up in the therapy speak of polyamory as being modern, progressive, and feminist and so on. But I think in general, those are not the models that are attracting glowing memoirs about the joys of polyamory. Right.
right. I mean, to be clear, I'm the memoir I was speaking of. I think the correct reading of it is that it is pretending to be glowing and is not in fact
Okay.
glowing. The really traditional form of polyamory and polygamy is also just organized much more around procreation, right, than contemporary polyamory. And there is, in the New York Magazine story, there's stuff about children and polyamory, and obviously you have both stories of, like, how do you, not there in particular, but generally, how do you explain to your kids or not explain to them that you have an open marriage? How do you, raise a child in a polycule? These kind of things. And there have been, especially since the 70s, sort of particular visions of a kind of matriarchal, right, kind of matriarchal communal modes of child rearing. But pretty clearly, figuring out ways to sort of organize around procreation is not what modern polyamory is about, right? Whereas traditional polygamy was basically like, well, you have this high status man, he's rich and powerful, he can father just as many children as 10 lower status men, right? And so you have a setup that is geared around his reproductive needs, but also, the idea that the sort of Genghis Khan effect, right, of high status sort of conquerors and would-be conquerors having a lot of children. And this is then in turn why contemporary polygamous communities organized around that model. The fundamentalist Mormons are the prime example, right, end up sort of expelling lots and lots of young men. You just end up with all these surplus men who are not needed for reproduction. And again, that's not really what, even in sort of contemporary incel discourse, right? It's not the incels, the involuntary celibate men, are not complaining about being excluded from the polycules. That's not where that discourse is operating, I think.
Yes, and I mean, given that polygyny specifically is such a common relationship model in human history, in pre-Christian history, it does seem to me that once you remove the limits that Christianity places on relationship structure, you can end up just drifting back towards that without meaning to. I'd be very interested to see research on what polyamory looks like in practice, because my suspicion is that even though the thruples that normally reach the cover of New York Magazine will tend to look very queer and progressive and novel in various ways, I bet that it's actually probably more Huberman-like in practice, because that seems to be a more natural model for humans to drift back towards. I don't think there's anything new under the sun, really. And so polyamory is very likely to end up looking much more traditional, is my guess.
Yeah, well, you could argue that in a way, sort of current polyamory discourse and kind of elite practice just trails way behind kind of the de facto polygamy that you see with, out of wedlock births, right? For instance, in poorer communities, right? Like if you mapped out of wedlock birth rates, you are going to get a lot of cases where you have a single sort of desirable man fathering an outsized number of children with a bunch of different women. They're not, again, it's not, that's totally informal. There's certainly no sort of therapeutic model holding it all together, nor is there a kind of fundamentalist Mormon model, but de facto, that's what you have. I mean, this is well, let's take two examples, right? There's sort of Nick Cannon, right? The American pop star who has, as far as we know, 12 children with 6 different women, 9 of whom I think were born within a couple of years of each other. And then running in as a kind of, a very different but very similar version of that, you have Elon Musk, right? Who is effectively practicing something similar with more formal relationships, more contracts, more surrogacy, or not surrogacy, but IVF, right? In some cases.
And surrogacy, I think, in some instances.
Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah. No, and surrogacy too. Yes. Sorry. It's hard to keep. It's hard to hard to keep track of all the different ways that Elon Musk is populating the Earth. But he, like Cannon, has an extended number of children, 11 that we know of, with, again, an extended number of women with whom he has various kinds of relationships. And again, this is sort of, it's not, I mean, it's a curious landscape because it's not formalized. There's no institution that Elon Musk is participating in that legitimizes all of those children, and the very idea of legitimacy in the traditional sense has sort of disappeared, right? But yeah, as you say, sort of de facto, the post-Christian billionaire is doing the kind of thing that a high status man in many pre-Christian societies would have done. And then, I mean, then there's sort of the intermediate phase of, the rich and famous celebrity who has a lot of kids in a second marriage and so on. That's the sort of more institutional middle ground. But you clearly have a lot of people now operating outside of that entirely, not serial monogamy, but just a lot of different kids in a lot of different ways.
It's interesting, isn't it, that there hasn't really been a concerted push to legalize polygamous marriage, even though that would be a perfectly sensible thing for campaigners to push for. It has historically been very normal. Even within the United States, there has been, as you mentioned, fundamentalist Mormons. And yet there hasn't really been, I guess, well, there could yet be.
Yeah, you've had some progressive jurisdictions take some steps, I think, towards opening benefits of various kinds to multiple partner households, I guess, or something like that, right? But yeah, there's no sense of this as a kind of civil rights crusade in the way that same-sex marriage was. And I think you could see various reasons for that. Part of it is, I think, this idea that we started with, right? That this is sort of by design, the kind of elite form is supposed to be a mode of experimentation that's supposed to have endless permutations and vary from couple to couple, right? Well, that's quite different from same-sex marriage. The successful claim that it made was that it fit into the relatively simple paradigm of opposite sex marriage, right? So it's harder to say, if your starting point is our model doesn't fit any conventional categories, it's harder to institutionalize it. There's also the taint that attaches to traditional polygamy, right? That, do you want to be launching a civil rights crusade on behalf of fundamentalist Mormons or certain traditional Muslims? I think there's sort of issues with that. But it is an interesting question generally, right? Where you have, you've written a bit about just sort of the idea of like re-paganisation, right? That like what you see in marriage and relationships, you also see in like religious practice, right? Like the Western world has a lot of post-Christian religious practice of various kinds, right? Overt sort of witchcraft and neo-paganism fit into this, hallucinogens, astrology, like, there's a wide range of sort of new age, neo-pagan, all these kinds of practices that sort of resist institutionalization, where, nobody is expecting there to be a kind of singular institutional form for post-Christian spirituality anytime soon, even though it's obviously becoming more and more influential in Western culture. And so it sort of exists in this kind of, liminal and inchoate zone, right? Where we end up sort of partially post-Christian, but the actual institutions that we have are still Christian. We still have churches. We still have the institution of marriage, right? Those are the institutions, but then the cultural practices are post, you could say.
Maybe in a funny kind of way, the campaign for same-sex marriage, the access, the campaign to change a Christian institution is essentially what that was, right? It was at a Goldilocks zone historically, where the Christian institution of marriage still had enough cultural power for it to be something that one would want access to as someone excluded from it. Whereas now maybe we're into the point where actually the new progressives don't care about accessing traditional Christian institutions because they don't regard them as having any cultural power. So they think, why would I waste my campaigning energies on that? Maybe that, yes.
Yeah, no, it's a hard, because of course there was this struggle within the gay rights movement in the 1990s, early on, especially in the United States, over precisely that question, whether it was worth sort of pushing for membership in a bourgeois, heteronormative, patriarchal, religious infused institution. And the people who won that argument, right, were the conservatives. Andrew Sullivan, the most famous example, the sort of center right Catholic, in complicated ways, right? His conservatism and his Catholicism are both very complicated, but he imagined himself to be engaged in a conservative project. And I think it's clearly the case that certain forms of same-sex marriage have ended up having a sort of conservative effect, in their sort of immediate impact. But then basically as soon as you had the decisions and changes actually winning the battle for Sullivan, the initiative passed completely to the people who had been opposed to him, right, 10 or 15 years before, which has then yielded the curious situation where, 10 years after the victory of the revolution that he sought, Sullivan is now sort of the famous critic of everything that's happened to the gay rights movement since, right? Transgender issues above all. And I don't know if you had somehow delayed the debate by 10 or 20 years. I mean, history doesn't really work like that, right? Debates come along at a particular moment for a reason. But it is an interesting question if you sort of started debating same-sex marriage afresh in 2025. Would the radical perspective be more powerful than the Sullivanian conservative perspective? I don't know.
I suppose if we look at the trans issue, which is the next one, at least in the UK, the Church of England has been very eager to embrace trans stuff in any way it can. They're offering things like rebaptizing people in their new gender identity and having trans clergy and all this kind of stuff, like super eager to be open to this new cultural political movement. But I don't really see evidence of trans campaigners caring very much one way or the other about whether or not they're granted access to Christian institutions and Christian forms of status. I think they don't really care. They're interested in accessing other kinds of institutions and other kinds of status, but maybe the radicals have won out and they've decided that actually they're not really playing for the Christian gallery.
Yes, although that may be more true in the UK, where Christianity is more at an ebb and where the Church of England is in a special ebb, right? I mean, I think if you look at debates within Roman Catholicism, I think there's still a kind of clear desirability, a clear sense that like having institutional sanction, religious sanction for this is important, and maybe obviously it's less important to secular people, but there is, I think, a pretty large constituency that's invested in, say, Pope Francis's friendly gestures to transgender people, and then bitterly disappointed when the Vatican puts out a document reaffirming traditional teaching. I mean, again, I do think that's it's less important than it would have been 25 or 30 years ago, that Catholicism too is just sort of seen as less important than it was when John Paul II was Pope. And Francis sort of stirred a bunch of media interest and attention early in his pontificate because, there was sort of interest in him as a liberalizer. But Catholicism per se, if he's not doing something sort of that seems liberal, there's just less interest. But there's still more interest in Catholicism than there is in the unfortunate Anglicans at the moment.
The unfortunate Anglicans. Might have to make that the title of the episode. Yes, I mean, if the repaganisation thesis is true, then I suppose one thing that we should expect to see is cultural and political power being located within different institutions, and therefore activist groups clamouring for access to those in lieu of access to the old Christian ones. So, for instance, Christian marriage. I can't think of an example off the top of my head.
Well, I mean, no, I mean that's broadly. I think that's broadly what you see. You see sort of bureaucratic institutions of that are seen to speak as voices of authority and expertise are the landscape of conflict, right? And you can see, the universities, especially in the United States, the NHS. It's very important what the American Medical Association and the medical authority say. It's very important what universities say, and the universities are, to a large degree, I think, sort of the which were the clergy were the second estate, right, in the French Revolution, and the nobles are the first estate. So the universities are effectively sort of a version of the second estate, or the universities slash sort of philanthropic NGOs, exactly. Yes. The blob in UK parlance, and there, yeah, I think what's interesting there, though, too, is that there is one difference between all of Europe, maybe especially the UK, I'm not sure, but sort of, let's say, Northern Europe and the United States, is that, in a way, it's been easier for those forms of authority to sort of end up sort of rebelling a bit against some of the overreach in sort of, claims about transgender medical care and puberty blockers and so on. It's been easier for pushback to happen in those contexts than it is in the United States, because in the United States there is a stronger form of conservative Christianity, and it's very important for institutions, universities, and medical associations and so on not to be seen as in any way endorsing conservative Christianity, right? You don't want to be on the same side as Ron DeSantis. And that in turn then makes it harder for those institutions to not go all the way with some of these ideas than it might be in Sweden, Denmark, places where nobody's that worried, right? I mean, I guess there's the fear of theocracy descending on Scotland, right, through the Forbes, right? Is it Forbes, right? Who's the Scottish?
Kate Forbes.
Kate Forbes, yes, right. So there's obviously sort of a residual panic about Calvinists or Catholics taking over, even in the UK. But generally, I think it's understood in Scandinavia and the United Kingdom, right, that the religious right is not coming. It's not a coming thing. And the United States, it's different.
I don't even think that the reaction against Christian politicians is a fear of them taking over. The fear is that they'll make your party look weird. I think actually it's like a reputational concern. There have been other examples of this. There's a recent case of a Lib Dem candidate who was basically chased out of his constituency because of being openly Christian, and particularly being pro-life. And the view from the local party was just this is reputational suicide. This guy has to go. So I think it's actually it's more depressing than that from a Christian perspective.
Well, but that also is sort of a limit on. It's kind of a limit on a repaganization thesis, right? Which is that in terms of anything associated with supernatural religion or anything like that, right? Like there's a lot of cultural post-Christian religious practices that would still be seen as sort of embarrassing and ridiculous if embraced by currently secular authorities, right? Like, even if lots and lots of people in England are suddenly practicing druidic rites, um, you know, Keir Starmer is not going to, it's not, it would, or, here I'm in New Haven in Connecticut in the United States, right? And right near Yale, right? And, the Yale law faculty is not, someone's not going to come out as a believer in astrology tomorrow on the Yale law faculty, even though lots and lots of sort of random Yale undergrads are using astrology apps, right? So there's this sort of coexistence where, yeah, you go into a Yale dining hall and sit down at a table and talk to a bunch of, smart undergrads, and they'll be like, yeah, I use this astrology app and I'm interested in this and that new age thing and so on. But nobody's getting tenure, right? Promising to bring astrological knowledge to bear. The only place where you see that is in some of the stuff with nods to like indigenous knowledge and indigenous ways of knowing, right? So you will get some kind of very woke, progressive, medical institutions and so on that feel like they have to sort of nod to Native American spirituality or things like that. But you could argue that that's just this kind of condescending gesture of allyship. And we're still a long way away from, the head of the American Medical Association reading the entrails, right, to determine which therapies to endorse.
Well, the strange point that we're at right now, and it doesn't necessarily undermine the repaganisation thesis, it may just be that repaganisation is a long process and that we're still at the point where Christianity has sufficient power to make it threatening. Being pro-life is threatening. Believing in astrology is not threatening within these institutions because Christianity has more power than the New Age religions do. One problem with the repaganisation thesis, so I don't think it's a fatal one, is that so much of the woke worldview is clearly derived from Christianity, is in some sense a Christian heresy. But I think it's quite likely that those Christian elements will fade with time. I think they're unlikely to withstand the more coherent worldview that like being fully pagan offers, because at the moment the woke worldview is very internally inconsistent on all sorts of things. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I wrote a book a long time ago now, like 12 years, right, about American religion. And the subtitle was How We Became a Nation of Heretics, right? And the argument was something like the arguments that you see with wokeness today, that even, that all of these aspects of contemporary American spiritual and moral life are still clearly derived from Christianity in some way, even if they're not formally Christian or traditionally Orthodox. It's not that different from Tom Holland's arguments about sort of the long shadow of Christianity over the entire history of the West. I do agree, though, right, that at a certain point, saying, oh, this is a heresy of Christianity because you can trace this genealogical connection is like, you're sort of confusing, you're running a genealogy and ignoring like speciesization, right? Like, at some point the evolutionary tree diverges enough that you're talking about something different. And I definitely think we're closer to that in the West than we were even 10 or 15 years ago, that there's just more overt post-Christian stuff, right? And on the right as well as the left, right? Like a figure, Bronze Age pervert is very much a figure of the 2020s and would not have been a figure of the early 2000s. I do expect the sort of separation to continue to some degree. I do think that wokeness, it has an idea about, the inverted hierarchy, right, and sort of the privilege of the oppressed and so on, that is really important to it overall, and is quite distinct from pre-Christian paganism. And so it's not clear to me that it can completely shake loose that, and that is something that comes out of Christianity. That I don't know. I feel like you'd have to have some further transmutation to really cut the cord altogether. Like there's just an idea about being kind in progressivism that just feels. I mean, yeah, again, you could say it's something new. It's post-Christian. It owes this debt to Christianity. It's not going to return. The new paganism is not just going to be like the old paganism. It's going to be kinder and gentler in some way because it comes after Christianity, right?
Maybe. Although it's also, I mean, the other thing that we have to, turning to another book of yours about the decadent society, it remains to be seen how all of that interacts with a post-abundance society, right, with declining wealth, which seems to be a very likely trajectory for the coming decades, just based on things like birth rates. Can something like euthanasia, right, which is very anti-Christian, just straightforward, it comes up in opposition to Orthodox Christian teachings with a small o, is endorsed by woke people with a sort of Christian justification sometimes, and that it will be along the lines of, it is the merciful thing, it is the kinder thing, granting people bodily autonomy. Tom Holland would say that these are all ideas derived from Christianity. I think he's right. But at some point, and particularly when you're butting up against material pressures. I mean, the reason why in Britain in particular assisted dying is so tempting for the government is because we have a socialised health system, and ill people are expensive. And I think that it's going to become more and more urgent, that push towards legalising it, because it's so good for the Treasury, essentially. And it has all these other sort of woke ideas that come along with it, which make it sort of convenient. But sort of at what point are you pursuing a policy which is so obviously not about protecting the weak, which is so obviously about killing useless, expensive people, right? While still claiming to have this rooting for the underdog central Christian message at the heart of the ideology? Like maybe eventually it just falls away.
Yes.
I don't know.
No, I think.
Can it be sustained?
I don't know. I think that's. And again, I think that like the Canadian euthanasia regime, I would not argue that that is a Christian heresy. That is just post-Christian. I'm just interested in sort of the extent to which, as you say, it sort of continues. What story is it telling itself, right? And it's not. Well, for instance, there's a guy named Richard Hanania, right, who you've undoubtedly encountered on the internet, right? Who's a sort of is presenting himself as a kind of right Nietzschean, sort of critic of, he's very anti-pro-life. He's, very anti-woke. It's, and he's been a vigorous defender of the Canadian euthanasia policies, but he has tried to defend them in sort of a straightforward kind of Nietzschean pagan, it's good to sacrifice for the community. It's heroic to kill yourself. It's sort of, the samurai code meets the Roman nobleman cutting his wrists in the bath and so on, right? So you could imagine a euthanasia regime built on that premise, right? But that's not what the Canadian regime is not saying that, right? It's not saying you are, Cato falling on his sword or something. It's speaking this sort of language of, we are extending care to marginalized communities in order to rectify. It's like, we need, if euthanasia ends up, what conveniently, sort of ending lots of lives of people on the margin who would otherwise cost the government lots of money. The Canadian government is not going to say, yes, these were weak people who needed to be sacrificed for the greater good, right? They're going to say, we are extending the modalities of available medical technology to underserved communities, right? And at a certain,
or they're going to conceal it,
or they're going to conceal it, right? And I agree that at some point that just probably becomes unsustainable as a balance, and maybe that's when you get the real Nietzschean arguments. But I don't. It would take a further shift, is all I'm saying, to get from we're at least pretending to be kind, right? Pretending to be
Yeah.
kind. The homage that the new paganism pays to its Christian antecedents, I guess.
Yeah. Where shame keeps its watch, virtue is not entirely extinguished from the heart.
That's the
As long as
optimistic.
that,
That's the well.
yeah.
No, but I've had this argument with people, right? Like that.
Mm-hmm.
I have said, well, it's better that to have a society that, I'm against abortion and against euthanasia, but I think a society that, you know, hurls children, you know, into into the woods sort of openly is worse than a society that has a lot of abortions, but people are sort of ashamed and don't talk about it, right? And similarly, uh, I think the same would go for euthanasia. But there are people who disagree with me and would say, no, it's actually this is the more, it's the more sort of, the more sustainable, the sort of hidden cruelty, right? That it's like the ones who walk away from Omelas, the short story about the whole society that's built on, the utopia built on the hidden torture of a child, right? And so it's worse if you're hiding from yourself the kinds of things you're doing. So that's, I mean, again, like, I would prefer not to live under the rule of the Aztecs, right? For instance, right? But there were people who will say no. They were open and honest about their human sacrifice. So
Yeah, I think I also prefer the hypocritical option. Hypocrisy can be quite good in the sense that you can have a slightly fragile equilibrium where societies have a sort of top-note message where we say, this is what we favour, this is what's normative, what's good. And yes, we know that there are sometimes people who, particularly in the elites, who behave differently and get away with it. But maybe you need that as a sort of outlet, in order to maintain the ideology. You sort of need to let people. This is what I think is very interesting about the Oscar Wilde case, which is so often misremembered. But that Oscar Wilde actually got away with having privately, mostly what he was doing, as I'm sure you know, was buying sex from adolescent boys. It wasn't actually it wasn't just his relationship with Bosie that was the problem. But he got away with that for a very long time until he decided to sue the Duchess of Queensberry for libel. And it was only then that the establishment was sort of forced to say, no, you really can't do this, right? But everyone was quite happy with a degree of elite hypocrisy in some marginal cases. And I actually think that kind of system, while fragile, is probably quite good, certainly better than sort of full Aztec.
well, I mean, I did a debate about euthanasia at Stanford not so long ago, and I don't think it went that well from my side, in part because the pro euthanasia debater essentially said, I don't want to defend the Netherlands. I don't want to defend Canada. I don't want to defend any of the kind of more maximal scope
The
situations.
actual
Well,
cases
no,
where
she said,
my
I want to
ideology
defend.
is
I want to
okay.
defend the model in California, right? And California
Okay.
has had physician assisted suicide in some, or assisted dying, right? Is the terminology, the preferred nomenclature. They've had it for a while, longer than the Canadian program, and it has been much more successfully limited. Now, I don't think those limitations will last forever because I think there is an underlying logic. But many, many fewer people die under this program than have died under MAID, medical aid in dying, in Canada. They really do try and limit it to people with a terminal diagnosis in the final months of life and so on, right? And I argued in the debate, I think correctly, right, that this is not really a logically tenable position, right? To say it's fine to kill yourself in this extremely particular situation, right? But but you're going to deny. You're saying this is an absolute right. You have total bodily autonomy as long as you have this particular diagnosis. But someone who is suffering much more in many other ways doesn't have that right. Like I don't think that makes sense, right? I don't think it's. But I'd rather have that model where many, many fewer people die from assisted suicide, right? Many fewer people kill themselves, than the more coherent and consistent model in Canada. And if you ask me, do I want the Canadian experiment to succeed? I'm sorry, do I want the Californian model to succeed? No, I want it to be rolled back. But would I rather that it stay at this equilibrium than go full Canada? I mean, yes, I would prefer the equilibrium, I guess.
The status quo in the UK is that while in practice it is illegal to assist someone in killing themselves, there's, to my knowledge, never actually been an instance of someone being prosecuted for doing one of these kind of mercy killings. It's particularly spouses, right, who will help very unwell elderly people to kill themselves. And yes, they do have to go through the stress of fearing prosecution. But there's this sort of recognition within the criminal justice system that we're not actually going to do it. We're not going to send someone to prison for doing this. And so there's this, uneasy recognition that the law isn't quite being enforced, but that's okay. And there are people who are, agitating. I think in some sense it's this sort of ultimate baby boomer, to not to rag on the boomers too much, but there is that feeling from some of the baby boomer campaigners for this, that they want to have absolute autonomy to resist nature right up until the final moments, to have absolute individual freedom right up until the final moments, regardless of what comes after.
Well, in a sense, right. And this sense that it's seen as sort of an extension in an odd way of other medical interventions. So when I did this debate, there was, in the audience, there was the husband of a young woman who died of cancer, terrible brain tumor of some kind. And she had been a campaigner for the right to physician-assisted suicide, and sort of carrying on her legacy is still part of these campaigns, right? And what he said to me in the Q&A was, he said, well, I'm going to ask you the same question that I asked the doctors, right, over and over again, which is, if you can't offer her, death, basically, what can you offer her? And the answer, obviously there are answers in terms of pain management and palliative care and all of these things, but fundamentally there isn't an answer, right? The answer is no. We don't offer you something, right? And I think there's a really deep and very understandably modern rebellion against that sense. It's like, well, if we can't do anything else, at least we can do this and have control over. We can't control how it's happening, but we can control how it's ending. I think that's a very powerful impulse that people have.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.